Hi, I'm Diane Lim. I'm Principal Economist here at the Conference Board. We're here in New York City today to provide you this special webcast on big data. The actual title is Why Big Data is Better for Understanding Human Behavior, also known as What's the Big Deal About Big Data, I would say. In today's webcast, we're going to talk about some critical questions and issues that are relevant to many researchers. We're going to talk about what is big data, how might we define it, and what's really new about it. What are the shortcomings of the more traditional survey data that economists and other social scientists tend to rely heavily on? How can researchers take advantage of big data, especially Google search data, to complement the data sources we already use and come up with better insights? But we also want to talk about some cautions or buyer beware about using big data. What are the cautions in terms of using it from a research perspective and also from an ethical one? So a little bit of housekeeping details. How can you participate in this webcast? Well, you can ask questions via the chat box that should appear on the bottom left of your screen, and I'll be trying to keep track of those as they come in. You can download the slide presentation via the file download pod in the bottom center of your screen, and you can view the video or the PowerPoint full screen by clicking on the 4 arrows at the top right of your screen. You can complete the brief evaluation at the end of the webcast to give us your feedback and so we can improve future programs. And importantly, because this webcast doesn't have a lot of slides, we don't have a huge amount of slides, it's really about a nice conversation that I'll have with our guests. You can share this program on demand with your colleagues, available about 48 hours after this live webcast. You can earn credits for this webcast if you've registered. You can type your full name and email address in the space provided under CPE credits. You can click OK for 3 pop-ups that will appear throughout the course of our webcast today. You have to stay online for the entire webcast, which should go almost an hour today. And credit is available only if you're participating live. So now I get to introduce our guest today. I'm really pleased to have Seth Davidowitz, who is the author of this book called Everybody Lies. And it's a best-selling book, and Seth is a former Google scientist, data scientist. He's also an economist, and he also is now a columnist for the New York Times, where you can read many of his insights. And I'm happy we're going to talk about Seth's book, like why it got so much attention, and also just have kind of fun talking about where can researchers get insights from your insights that you discuss in the book. So welcome, Seth. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan.
Good. So what I'd like to do is to open up by talking a little bit about how you came to decide to write this book. And I assume it was after your stint as Google data scientist. Like, what did you learn while working at Google that made you want to write this book? And what has gotten the most buzz out of what you've written about in this book so far?
Yeah, so actually the research I started before I worked at Google. I was doing my PhD in economics, and I found this tool, Google Trends, which tells people where certain things are searched, when they're searched most frequently. And I kind of became obsessed with this data to the point I couldn't really think about anything else for the next few years, because there were so many advantages of it, as I guess we'll talk about over the next 55 minutes with this data relative to other data sources. And I continued the research while I was at Google, and then wrote the book. And I guess I just wanted to keep getting these ideas out there, and kind of I thought it'd be useful. I thought there were things we could use, ways we could use this data to maybe improve society. So I wanted to kind of get those ideas out there. And what got the most attention is probably the sex section, which we're not going to talk about today. But I think
Well,
sex
except
definitely.
for how it has to do with the economy.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that. Yeah. I don't know how much I can help there, but I think that people were interested. That's not the only thing that people are interested in. I think people are interested more and more kind of what is this big data thing. So another thing I want to do is kind of simplify the term for people and to make it more understandable because I think people are a little intimidated. Uh, what is big data? What do I need to know? How can I, is this something that there's no way I'm ever going to understand? Who do I hire to do this? And I think hopefully after reading this book, they'll have a little better idea of what the concept means.
Well, I think when I was reading your book, the thing that really hooked me in was not the sex part, but actually your example talking about the results of the presidential election. And how pollsters got it all wrong. Like, what was the probability that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election when we were on election day morning? What was it? It was like 90 some percent, wasn't it?
It depends who you ask.
Okay.
Nate Silver actually was lower than that. He only said 70%, but some of them using polls said 90 or 95%.
Right. So we headed into election day with all the pollsters weighing in on it and everyone saying it was almost a sure thing. And then, of course, we know what happened. And it was just a shock. I think what people were surprised about is how could the pollsters have been so wrong?
Yeah.
So how do you explain how the pollsters were so wrong about the election?
Well, I did predict that, despite what everybody's saying, that Trump was going to win. But,
wow.
But to be honest,
were you on the record for that?
I was on the record.
Oh, you were.
But
wow.
I'm not sure if that was because of the data or just because I'm a huge pessimist. Because I hated Donald Trump, and I'm always, to be honest, I'm always predicting horrible things are about to happen.
Oh no.
So that may have influenced my my prediction, but there were some signs in the data. So one of them that I think was very, very clear was that there was going to be a big drop in African American turnout because if you ask anybody in a survey, are you going to vote in the upcoming election? The vast majority of people say yes, even if they're not going to vote at all. And because they want to feel good about themselves or make the pollster feel good about them. And you can actually use Google searches to predict turnout by looking for searches in the run up to the election for how to vote, where to vote, places to vote, voting information. And these are highly predictive of how high turnout's going to be. And one of the things you saw very, very clearly in this data was that these searches were plummeting in cities. We don't have individual data, we just have aggregate data, but they were plummeting in cities that are 90-95% black. So it was clear that black turnout, and the polls weren't predicting this, they were predicting black turnout was going to be about the same as it was in the previous election. So that was one reason it was pretty clear that Hillary was going to do worse than the polls suggested, because African Americans are much more likely to support the Democratic candidate.
Right. I mean, in some ways was the faulty poll data kind of it became a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of the voter turnout, because if you're going to vote for the candidate that has a 90-some% chance of winning, you sort of feel like your vote isn't going to matter, right?
There is some evidence for that. The turnout does go down when people think that
it's not close.
It's not close.
Yes.
I don't know that played a huge role in this election, because that could also influence Trump voters. If they think their candidate has a 10% chance of winning, they may say, what's the point of going out? So it's not clear that really necessarily was a big factor against Hillary. And
what was the sort of cultural evidence that you saw in the Google data that supported a Trump victory?
Well, one of the big things that the way I started this research before I worked at Google, when I was just a PhD student, was using Google searches to measure racism in the United States. And I was shocked by how frequently people make racist searches, kind of looking for jokes mocking African Americans, and particularly and not just in areas you might expect from our country's history, like Alabama or Mississippi, but also Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio. And these searches did increase right when Obama was elected. And I think there was a lot of anger based at Obama's race that was definitely helping Trump a lot, that people weren't talking about. That was one of the reasons that he was saying these things where if you ask any of the conventional sources, he was saying the dumbest things, like when he was attacking Obama on the birth certificate issue. People would say, you have no idea what you're doing. This is the stupidest thing. And when he was saying such racially charged things, retweeting David Duke, a lot of people would say that's a huge error, a gaffe. But I think when you look at the search data and how much racism there secretly is in the country, it's not quite the gaffe that people maybe thought it was.
So, you talk a lot in this in your book about how big data or internet data is very different from survey or polling data, in that your thesis is it's sort of a online truth serum of sorts. And what is it about, do you think, that is about, like, when people are asked these survey questions, whether it be for who you're going to vote for or how much money you spent on something last month, why do you think there's a problem there in terms of people revealing the truth?
Yeah, well, there are a couple issues. One is that people are just lazy and sometimes are pissed at surveyors. So they just answer randomly.
Yeah.
If you ask someone what color is I saw a survey recently. They asked what color is a green ball, and the choices are green and red. And I think about 10% said red, just because
God.
they're just like, I don't want to answer your stupid
They just
question.
don't care.
Yeah, either they just don't care, they're
Or they're
picking
being
randomly,
funny.
or they're being funny.
Yeah.
That particularly is a huge issue among teenagers.
Yes.
There was a recent study I talk about in the book where they asked teenagers whether they were adopted and whether they had a drinking problem, and they found there was a big correlation between self-reported being adopted and self-reported having a drinking problem. But some researchers went back over this data and looked more closely at the individuals who had answered it, and found that more than half of the teenagers who said they were adopted weren't really adopted. They just thought it was humorous to answer in a survey and say you're adopted. So that's one issue. I think the other issue is that people are uncomfortable saying certain things or writing certain things, particularly if there's a human being listening, even if it's supposedly anonymous. People aren't so comfortable saying, that they're not going to vote, or that they're broke, or that they're wasting money on frivolous products, or that they read gossipy magazines. There are many things that I think people aren't so proud of.
Yeah.
And if you just ask them, they tend to pretend that they're different people. It's the same. It's in many ways a habit that carries over from real life. There are numerous studies documenting that a huge percentage of things that human beings say are lies. They're little white lies, right? You don't tell how you really feel about a person. You don't tell what you're really doing. You you present an image of yourself that makes you look better than you truly are, and that habit carries over frequently in anonymous surveys.
And so the point of your book is that when you're online and you're just by yourself and you're just Googling things, that there's no reason for you to kind of hide the truth, because that's just preventing you from getting the information that you really want.
Yeah, it's not. It goes even further. It's not just that there's no reason to hide the truth. There's a reason to give the truth.
Right. To get an accurate answer.
Yeah. So if you've never voted in the last 3 presidential elections and you're going to vote, you might need to Google how to vote, where to vote. If you enjoy racist jokes,
right,
then you want to see the newest jokes that have come out and be entertained by them. So Google kind of gives you an incentive. It's a word economists love, an incentive to tell the truth. Surveys never give you an incentive to tell the truth. Whether they give you an incentive to fully lie, they definitely don't give you an incentive to tell the truth. But Google does. And one thing I also want to point out, we're talking about the internet data. There's a huge difference here between Google and social media.
Yes. Okay.
Because social media, not only social media are in many ways for these sensitive topics worse than surveys, because not only do you not have an incentive to tell the truth, you have a huge incentive to lie because all your friends are seeing.
You're just talking about the good parts of your life.
Yeah, what you're saying. So I've done little studies where you compare, for example, the National Enquirer versus the Atlantic Monthly, and we know that the National Enquirer, the lowbrow gossipy magazine, is more popular. It sells more copies than the Atlantic Monthly, the highbrow serious magazine. But on Facebook, the National Enquirer is 45 times more popular because the Atlantic Monthly is 45 times more popular because everyone wants their friends to think they're more intellectual and serious than they are. So you see that over and over again. So we have to be a little careful when we talk about digital truths here. It really is only certain sources.
Where you feel like no one's watching.
Yeah, particularly people's internet searches, where I think you have this revolutionary new insight into certain parts of the human mind. And Facebook or Twitter data, there's definitely are insights to be found there, but you have to be a little more careful
Right.
of how honest some of this data that people are reporting to Facebook or Twitter is.
So I use Google all the time, not just in my personal time when I think I'm all alone, but at work all the time when I'm looking up references, right, or looking up spelling of words. I use it all the time. And so I wanted to poll our audience and kind of get a handle on. We have a couple of poll questions we'll ask
today. Kind of ironic
today.
After I attack polls, now you're going to ask everybody.
Now I'm going to do a poll, but we don't know who they are. This is anonymous responses still.
Yeah.
And it's you should have full incentive to be truthful in your answers today. So if I could get the poll question put up, here we go. And so I just want we want to know how much you use Google and why. So the question is, how often do you Google things, look up information via Google searches? And the choices are nearly every day and many times throughout each day for both work and personal interests. Often, but mostly in my personal time for personal interest. Often, but mostly for work-related research. Only occasionally, less than a few times a week. And rarely, only when researching for a very specific work project or personal decision. So I kind of rigged this question, it looks like.
Seems to be a blowout.
But,
No, some people only do it often, not nearly every day.
Only do it often.
But it seems like nobody does it rarely.
Nobody does it rarely, yes. So, and I think this is probably highly correlated with, do you carry a smartphone around and look at it like several times a minute?
Probably.
Okay, so, you just always have it handy to look up things as you go about your daily business.
Yeah.
So obviously we use it a lot, and what is interesting to me is that people use it a lot at work, right? I mean, it's a very helpful, it's a very useful research tool. Google is, I find, it's tremendously useful because you can look up academic literature even on Google, and it's very good at sorting through that. And so turning to the more mundane uses of survey data and online data, I wanted to talk a little bit more about, most of the data sets that economists use to study and predict the economy are official government data sources. They're collected from surveys, either surveying businesses or households. And they're pretty aggregate in nature. They're fairly low frequency. They don't come out very often, certainly not daily. And they don't really it allows economists to study sort of macroeconomic relationships, but it's difficult to look at that macro data and figure out sort of what individual behavior or individual business behavior added up to those aggregate measures that we see. And so I am hoping today, not just during this webcast, but we're having a meeting that we'll cover on Facebook Live right after this webcast, that we can kind of brainstorm a little bit about different economic questions that we as economists have had trouble really answering very well so far, and what your thoughts might be on how Google search data or other forms of internet data could help us do a better job at understanding behavior, economic behavior, and predicting the effects of policies or business practices on the economy. And I want to bring up one of your examples that you brought up in the book, which is how sex kind of connects to the economy.
I didn't think about that.
Which is, you were talking about understanding where people are unemployed, right? Now, the way we at the conference board like to understand where people are unemployed is we wait for the Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly employment report, and we look at what BLS tells us about the unemployment rate and jobs and job creation. But you found that certain Google searches are highly correlated with unemployment rate. And what were those searches? You don't have to get very specific.
Yeah. So what? So I was looking if you can use Google, and a lot of people are researching this, uh, including a lot of feds around the world are starting to use research this data and use this data. But one of the searches that correlate with unemployment and would be available earlier would be so one of them was pornography, which where sex come in, but also people search for solitaire more when they're unemployed, which I guess is a good thing because it means that people aren't search for solitaire more when they're out of work than they're at work, which is like a good sign for the economy. But it's kind of interesting whether you could use that data to predict the actual unemployment rate. I don't know if that's necessarily the best use case of it, but it's also I think one of the things we can do is get different measures of the economy.
Yeah.
So right now we have very, very simple measures. Either people are working or they're not working. But sometimes people are employed, but they spend maybe 7 hours on Facebook or or playing solitaire or doing on ESPN. They're not necessarily fully engaged in what they're doing. And I think you could imagine using some of this data to supplement the research, not just on how many people are working, but how much on-the-job leisure there might be, how much underemployment there is in various companies. So that's an advantage. And the other advantage that you were getting at is it's very aggregated because a survey, one disadvantage of a survey is because it's a limited number of people. You don't have huge samples for small areas of the country. Right. So, if you do a survey of 10,000 people, then a big city like New York, you might have a few hundred people, but a smaller city, you might only have 10 or 15 people. In a tiny town, you're going to have 0 or 1 people. But with Google searches, because it's basically everybody's data and all this data is anonymous and aggregate, you can really zoom in on any part of the country or any part of the world and have a much better idea of what's going on. So that's another huge advantage of the search data, along with the honesty.
And with the Google search data, the example that you brought up about correlation with unemployment rates, are you also able to see what time of day people are doing those searches?
So you can now. When I was originally doing the research, you can't, but now you can look at minute by minute or hour by hour data. So it's
basically a way of measuring kind of in real time who has idle time available.
Right. I think it's I think you can imagine a lot of different internet sources contributing to that.
Right.
But definitely the searches I think would be a pretty good measure of what people, as you said, you're doing work-related searches, and I guess from the survey, a large percentage, more than 90% of people do work-related searches, but probably some days there's not much work for them to do, and they instead are doing, entertainment searches or looking for games to play. And it would be really interesting to see, to use this data to measure idleness at work.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're always trying to figure out here at the conference board is, we put out the Consumer Confidence Index and leading economic indicators. We're trying to use past data and survey data, asking people about what they plan to do in the future, or what their attitudes are for the strength of the economy or the favorability of the business climate, to give some prediction about where the economy is going. How our search data, it's difficult because we're just asking them, how do you feel? No, how do you really feel, right? And, how does the Google search data kind of what kinds of questions would people be Googling that might indicate what they're going to do in the future? Like if they're actually looking for a job, but they actually told the surveyor that they're not in the labor force, they're not really looking for a job, but they would take, what if it turns out they just don't want to say that they're looking for a job because they don't have a job, right? And maybe they are kind of looking for a job. How would we go about understanding that?
Yeah, you can. I think you could use this data for all kinds of, for measuring how many people are really looking for a job. That would be one use case. You have to be careful because sometimes searches for jobs are for Steve Jobs, the Apple guy, so that you get new issues when you deal with this data.
But people might search for jobs in whatever their occupation is near me or something.
You can dig down. You can see people who are maybe looking to switch careers or what are the hot areas in the employment market. You can do lots of things like that, or predicting what purchases people are going to make. If they're making big purchases, you probably do start Googling many months out that you're looking for a new car or a new house. And so that could probably be a more accurate measure of demand. I think people are really, really bad at predicting what they're going to do in the future.
Right.
And one thing that we're learning, not just from search data, but from all different big data sources, is that frequently algorithms are better than people in predicting what that person's gonna do in the future. Part of it is because we lie to ourselves. I think one example I talk about in the book is Netflix used to they want to queue up videos for you that ready to be watched when you kind of go to the website. So if you right now want to watch a certain movie, you can tell Netflix what I might want to watch in 2 or 3 days in case you forget. So you're ready to
set up a queue.
Yes, you're ready to be greeted with that information. And I think what they found is when they did that, people always said in 2 or 3 days they want to watch like historical documentaries. Not the things that they necessarily enjoy the most, but the things they think they should do. Tomorrow I'm going to start my diet. Tomorrow I'm going to go to the gym. Tomorrow I'm going to watch documentaries. And then Netflix found that they're actually could make better predictions just doing an algorithm looking for, to predict what they're actually going to want to watch in 3 days, which is probably pretty similar to the stuff they're watching now, which is more lowbrow material. So I think that's an area, that's one area where we know the reason that people lie to themselves about that they're going to, in positive directions, they're going to do more positive things in the future than they actually do. I think in general, we're really, really bad for many reasons in predicting what we're going to do.
So we're bad at self-prediction, self-predicting our behavior in the future, but we're also bad at self-reflecting on what we already did in the past. And so surveys are basically asking us to self-reflect, to recollect and self-reflect, and to self-predict our future, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, one point I want to make, I don't want to, I think maybe in the book, one thing I regret is I maybe came almost too hard against surveys, that they're like useless and we never have information. Sometimes you can sometimes surveys do have predictive power. Even in the previous election, while they didn't get the winner right, they correlate very highly with which states are going to support more Trump or Clinton. So it's not like everybody's just randomly totally answering surveys and we just throw them out and nobody knows anything. And sometimes that is the only way to actually know. There's no real other way except to ask people. Even I've been trying to do research. Maybe we'll get into it a little bit on gun control is a hot issue. And, I write this New York Times column, and I'm kind of running out of ideas. So I usually get emails from people like suggesting things to do. And sometimes it's recently people are like, how many people really support gun control? And I couldn't necessarily think of a way to use Google searches to measure that, because it's not like people just say, I support gun control or I don't support gun control.
You don't know which side of the issue they're on.
I think you can get a good measure of how much interest there is. You couldn't get an issue what questions people have, whether the issue is sustained. That's a really interesting question. How high the interest is relative to other events. I think there's this idea that after this Florida shooting, I think most people think this time is different. Like there's going to be a change. People are really energized about gun control. But if you look at actually the search volume for gun control, it's pretty comparable or even lower than after some other previous events. Like the Sandy Hook shooting actually led to a bigger increase in gun control searches. So that can kind of put things in perspective. But I don't think you can necessarily, just from what people are searching, know exactly how many people support gun control. A survey may actually be better, even with all the deception and the lying. It may be more approximate to closer to the truth to just ask people, do you support gun control? Because people don't say it into a Google box. I support gun control.
They're not declarative statements in the Google search box.
It's hard. I think you can see maybe comparative. There's probably more interest in gun control in these places than those places. There's more interest now in gun control than there was a week ago. But to know exactly how many people support gun control just from Google searches would be pretty tough. A survey might actually be better for that.
So I want to get to some questions from the audience, and then I want to put up our next poll question. But first, the questions. Let me see here. Melissa writes, how do you validate that searches for solitaire or porn correlates to unemployment?
So that's in my book. It's actually, I used a tool called Google Correlate, which is a service made by Google where you can put any time series into that data, and it will find the searches that have the highest correlation with that data set you put in. So what I did is I put in monthly unemployment rate data, and then it told me these are the 100 searches that have the highest correlation with the unemployment
with the time
data,
series.
With the time series.
It also does cross-sectional
and
correlation,
you
right?
can also say this is a state level data set. What's the highest correlation with that? So
Yeah.
we've done things like we've put in unhappiness rates and what are the highest correlations, or bad health, what are the highest correlations?
Yeah,
And you
so-
sometimes see things like smoking or
Yeah,
so,
I feel like we need to stress that this is correlation, not causation, right? We don't know what causes what. We just know that it's highly correlated,
Right,
that
but I
they
think
move together.
for the examples we're talking about, that's really kind of to some degree all we care about, because we're just trying to measure
Right.
the unemployment rate or measure the future economic performance. So we don't need the reason that people are out of work for that particular project, or the reason that the economy is going to grow. We're just trying to make a prediction, forecast which way it's going to go.
Yes, my colleague Ataman just typed in a question: does Google Correlate warn users that correlation does not mean causation?
I mean, I think the name, it's not called
It's not
Google
causation.
So I think.
Well, yeah, I think
I've
Ataman thinks there needs to be a disclaimer or something.
Well, one thing I'm not sure I agree with Ivan, because I think if anything, that correlation is not causation is so hammered into people's heads right now that people say it too much. When anytime you don't like a statistical study, people just say correlation does not equal causation, and it's not kind of like thought out. Correlation doesn't equal causation, but it might be suggestive, and you have to. What is the potential alternative explanation? How could we test that? So I think we've done a pretty good job as statisticians and economists in telling people that correlation does not equal causation. But I think now we have to also say that sometimes it can equal causation, or sometimes and you can't just throw out statistics you don't like by saying correlation does not equal causation.
Well, and I think you make the point in the book that sometimes all you need is the correlation to come up with like a policy implication.
Yeah, or
right?
particularly,
like you don't have to know why it's happening. You just have to know.
Also for predictive purposes.
Right.
If you're trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, you don't need to know the reason that your variables correlate. You just know they do correlate, and if they're high, your prediction is going to be high as well.
And Patrick asks, how does this cover iPhone and iPad users who are less likely to use Google? Is that true?
I don't know if iPhone and iPad users are less likely to use Google. It definitely only covers people who use Google, so it doesn't include people who don't. I think one thing that I remember Steve Jobs talked a lot about this, that with iPhones, people are more likely to use apps relative to searches.
Oh,
so,
I see.
For example, if you're looking for a restaurant, I think 10 years ago, if people were searching for a restaurant, they would have all used Google, and now people might open a Yelp app.
I see.
And just search there. So
okay,
you have to be careful. This actually, there's another question with that. How do you ensure
that search data? Another question from Adman: how do you ensure that search data will be representative for the overall population without a solid survey sampling design?
I think that's related to Patrick's question as well, because it kind of is. We don't have a great answer for that.
Yeah.
I think we know that the search data in general, even though we don't have a great survey design, it has big correlations. So the places that search for God the most are the Bible Belt, and the places that search for unemployment benefits the most are people tend to have more people out of work, more people looking for collecting unemployment rates. So over and over again, the data does tend to correlate even without a weighting. It would be nice, I think. It's also difficult now because all the data is just anonymous and aggregate, so it's a little hard. Usually,
you don't know how to weight it.
The ways that surveys are weighted is by taking into account the demographics of the individuals.
Right.
Who are answering, but we don't know what individuals are making the search. So it's definitely problematic, and you want to be cautious in using the data. But in general, I think we found that the data, even without proper statistical weighting, is probably more powerful than you'd expect and does correlate more frequently than you'd expect with real-world outcomes. Hopefully in 5 or 10 years, they'll find a way to use this data while protecting users' anonymity and to weight it and do other tricks and maybe take into account how many people are using different methods to access Google. But right now we don't have all that. We just have the blunt data, which still is powerful, still is useful, still is, I think, underutilized, but definitely
But it doesn't include the entire universe of the population because
Yeah,
know,
I mean,
old people, there are not very many old people that use Google.
No data source really includes the whole population,
Right.
except maybe the census,
Right.
because surveys, a lot of people hang up, and
Right.
but I think crucially, it's not weighted data because we don't know.
Yeah.
We know that old people use it less, but we don't know precisely how much less
Right.
they use it. So right now, it's totally unweighted. It probably will get better in the future if
more people are using it.
Not only if more people are using it, but if Google finds a way to protect users' privacy while still
identifying key demographics.
Giving some way to allow outside researchers, methodologists to weight the data. It's kind of interesting. This may be a little bit of a geeky point, but you said this would be a geeky
we should
talk,
go with it.
I think initially the Google, I was studying the Google search data in 2012 when it was considered so weird and so strange because all the points that Adavan and Patrick and everyone else are bringing up, that it's not representative data, it's not weighted, and I think my personality, one fair criticism of me is I'm maybe more excited by ideas. I'm not the most detail-oriented person, so I get really, really excited. My hand starts shaking when I'm exploring an idea. I'm so into the stories that we can tell in data that I'm the type of person who does likes to do studies in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, not 5 years.
Right.
And I think I think there is some use to that personality in research. There's also use in research for people who spend 5 years on finding out exactly what the standard error should be, which is not me at all. And I think the type of people who have that personality or have devoted their careers to those questions initially basically ignored Google data because their response was just, this is too weird, we're not going there.
Yes.
And I think in the future, I'm hoping that people, more methodologists, are going to start studying this data and say, okay, it's weird, it's not a random sample, it's not a survey, but clearly there's information in here. Can we use our expertise to find ways to make it even more powerful by finding ways to weight the data?
Right.
So I think I do think as good as the data is right now, it probably will get better as more methodologists
weigh in on it.
Weigh in and start, start really getting into the nitty gritty of the ways to make it most powerful.
Okay, Brian, I see your question, but I'm going to hold that for a little later in the show because it's a good one. It's a good kind of closing question, actually. So I wanted to go back to the survey. Let's go back to traditional surveying and kind of an example of a question that might show up in an economic survey. I wanted to pose it to the audience, and I wanted you guys to kind of tell us how you would formulate an answer to the question. So suppose a survey researcher asks you to estimate how much you spent in total on your non-perishable consumer goods over the past month. How are you most likely to go about answering that question? Like, how would you gather the information? Would you try to recollect off the top of your head where you went shopping and how much you spent? Just really try to think back over the past month. Would you actually get out your checkbook or your credit card statements and look up your purchases that way? Would you log on to Amazon Prime and just look up your past orders if you order a lot from Amazon? Would you just make up a number that sounds kind of ballpark reasonable? Or would you actually not even respond to the survey since you wouldn't want to go to the trouble of figuring it out and you're not getting an Amazon gift card in return for participating in the survey or something?
I know what category I'm in. I'm curious what
okay.
everybody else is.
So the votes are coming in. Right now, recollection off the top of the head is coming in first. And
I'm not seeing the results.
Oh, you're not seeing the results?
Oh, now I see it. Yeah,
okay.
I see it.
So it looks like not too many people look things up.
Yeah. I'm always surprised anybody. I'm always surprised anybody takes surveys seriously. So
I know when there's not a consequence.
Yeah,
right?
I thought surveys would be useless. So I'm an example. Like Google now does surveys as you go around the web. You might notice sometimes to read a website, you have to fill out a survey.
A short
and that's
little
all
survey.
done through Google Consumer Surveys.
Right.
And anytime I get that question, I just click something.
Random?
I don't take it seriously. I've never once taken that question seriously. And I
Yeah.
just assume everyone else is like me.
Yeah.
But I think a lot more people than I realize.
I mean, I think people have to feel like there's a reason why their opinion would really matter.
Yeah.
Like there's a consequence to choosing the right answer.
Right.
Like that. But apparently, well, so 43%. Most people, or almost half people of the participants, said that they would actually try to recollect what they spent. So at least they're not outright, making something up. And only a quarter would make something up. And then, but almost 20% wouldn't respond at all.
Yeah. See, and I think that this is a little bit already people are being dishonest to this survey, because we know from survey rates that the response rate to surveys now is only about 8%. So I think 92% of people really would. So I think 92% of people, if they were being really honest.
Well, but this is a biased sample, of course.
Yeah. So we don't know. We don't know. My guess is that even among this engaged audience, that probably a higher percent than admitted would not respond to the survey. But I don't know. I'd be curious.
Okay.
I guess it's a biased sample because they're already answering your survey, right?
Yes, so, it's a biased sample. Yes, this is not even a full sample of the people who are listening in.
Yeah.
It's the people who are responding to our poll. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about employment data. One thing that I did a few months ago when, oh gosh, my colleague's going to have to refresh my memory if it was September employment report. I think it was September's employment report. It was the first employment report after Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. So it was either September or it was probably September that came out in the beginning of October, right? The September employment report. And BLS put out that it was kind of a bad month in terms of number of jobs added. I think there was a job loss, and that the reason was probably had something to do with the hurricanes. And they mentioned Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. And so I decided, this is interesting because they're not saying whether it was Harvey or Irma or how important each of those were. And so I went on Google Trends and I just typed in unemployment benefits, like people searching for how do I file for unemployment benefits. And you saw very clearly then, you can look at Google Trends in terms of geographic concentration and timing. Like, so throughout the month of September, I could look day by day at how many Google searches there were for unemployment benefits and where they were concentrated geographically. And both the timing and the geographic pattern of the searches just showed that people were much more concerned about how to file for unemployment benefits right after Harvey made landfall in Texas than right after Irma made landfall in Florida. So everyone was talking about this. Like all the economists here were anticipating that Harvey was a much bigger economic event than Irma. But it was something that we would have to wait a while before BLS data would tell us that, right? And so I thought that's a use of Google data that's sort of purely supplemental to the story that comes out of the official, from the official data. And I found that really interesting, and I have no special access to Google Trends, right? Anyone can do this. You can type in any search term.
I think people are always surprised. They think that I have like some secret code to get data, and there are definitely tools. I've been doing this for so long that I probably
you have access to a lot of stuff.
No, I don't have access to anything special, but I know the way around. I know the ways around the data. I know little tricks to get better data sometimes, but all of them are tricks available to anybody. And even just the basic data, I think still not everybody knows that anybody can see how frequently something is searched over time, and that's a great use case that I think of the types of ways you can use this data. And you could also imagine other questions to see what other questions people were asking after the hurricane, and also whether the effects were concentrated just in that region, or whether how far did they spread. So you could kind of gain a lot of insights using this data.
And I think one of the big mysteries in terms of labor, the labor part of our economy, has been what's going on with labor force participation and underemployment. And actually, Patrick asked the question, BLS, has these underemployment measures, the broader measures of unemployment or underemployment, the U1 through U6. And can you tell things? Can you see things like employed part-time for economic reasons? Like, what are some Google search terms that would gain us that would be correlated with that?
Yeah, so there are two ways. It's an interesting question, and I think my general answer to people when they say, "Can you learn this from Google data?" is probably there are some insights you might not get exactly, but if you're interested in that question, like I encourage you to, just as you were doing,
just put it in.
Yeah, put it in. Like, see if you. I don't think I think there might be insights in that there, but there are two kind of methodologies you can imagine. One is you could use Google Correlate to correlate part-time employment and say when people are part-time employed, what are they Googling? That's kind of the prediction method to say, okay, here's maybe just like their Solitaire is a measure of unemployment. When people are part-time employed, they look for afternoon matinee play performance.
Right.
I don't know. You never know, right?
Right.
You could people probably do differ when they're part-time employed, or you could also think about full-time employment opportunities. There are many things that someone part-time employed might be searching for.
And could you, for the benefit of the audience, explain, like when I go onto Google Trends, to be honest, the way I find Google Trends is I Google Trends.
I do.
I literally do that.
I do that.
And then you go onto Google Trends. If you guys just Google Trends, you will come to the Google Trends homepage. And from Google Trends homepage, right, you can get to the Correlate tool.
The Correlate tone.
No.
To get Google Correlate, I Google Correlate and go. It's definitely a separate website. It may be linked.
It's linked on the Google Trends homepage.
Yeah, but you can definitely also just go to it. But Google Correlate.
So yeah, I encourage you guys to kind of play around with this. Like if there's a data series that you regularly use for your research, whether it be time series or cross section, just kind of feed it into the Google Correlate tool and see what are the search terms that correlate with it. It might be kind of surprising, and maybe some of the correlations you won't be able to explain. Yeah. But some of them you probably will be.
Yeah. One danger you see is there are two dangers that come up frequently is seasonality in the correlation. So if you have a data set that's very seasonal, that's always high on winter, you might say sweaters is the top correlate, and it's all you really learn from that is that people search that in December and November. Right. Or one thing that also happens frequently is if you have a big trend, a data set that's trended over time, then the correlations tend to be searches that have just gone up a lot.
Right.
If your data set's just gone up over time, then the searches go up over time, and that is an area where you get the correlations.
And not causation.
It's not even that it doesn't equal causation. I think it's not even predictive at that point, because all you're really saying is that in the past they've trended in the same direction, though they might stop in the future.
So
Melissa admitted that she made up her answer.
I saw Melissa. Thank you for coming clean there. She says, I admit it. I made it up. Her answer. I make it up. So before we get to the end, because we're nearing the end, I wanted you to tell one story about how your grandma is a data scientist, and sort of a warning to the rest of us who are who think we're great data scientists ourselves, just based on things that are on the top of
the story I tell in the book is. I was at Thanksgiving. I was 33, and my family was trying to give me dating advice because I didn't have a date. I was 33. It's time to get married. And my family, I come from a loud New York Jewish family, and they were. So I think the dating advice was my sister was saying that Seth needs a crazy girl because he's crazy, and my brother Noah was saying that. Seth needs a sane girl to balance him out because he's crazy, and then my mom was saying that stop saying that Seth's not crazy, and then my dad was screaming, "You're crazy! Of course Seth's crazy!" Everyone's basically just screaming at each other, which is a kind of a classic Davidowitz Thanksgiving dinner. But then my grandmother said that Seth needs a nice girl, not too pretty. She said, good social skills, social so you'll do things, good sense of humor, and I think. What I said is that why was grandma's advice so much better than the rest of my family's advice? And one reason is that grandma is big data. So if you think it's actually, I think, an important point that the elderly historically have been a very valued resource for the exact reason that the big data is a valued resource, that they have more data to collect than anybody else, and they can. So my grandma can
stored
say
it.
exactly. So yeah, she's stored how many relationships has she seen in her life? She's seen probably thousands of marriages and which ones worked and which ones didn't work, and made her prediction based on that. So I thought that was kind of. I think it also makes a point that I wanted to make in the book, which is that a lot of people are intimidated by big data and they think of it as a very technical, statistical, machine learning, AI, complicated uh, domain, and it definitely is at points. If you're trying to predict, drive a car using big data, I think grandma's methodologies aren't going to work. But I think when you do some social science with big data, frequently the methodologies are very intuitive. So the same tools that grandma uses or doctors use to diagnose disease is basically how people analyze big data. You try to correlate different events and see which ones correlate the most, and then think through, is it a causal story? Is it just a correlation? How can we test that? So that was kind of the grandma big data story.
Great. I love that. And now I want to turn to Brian, my colleague Brian's last question that I was saving because it's a good way to conclude. What are the risks that a campaign next election could, quote unquote, Google bomb voter search data now that your book has been written?
So one thing I've learned from writing in a popular press and also writing a book is not to get delusions of grandeur about how many people are reading your your book. So I'm not saying nobody reads my stuff, but I don't know that many people are reading it. But that said, I think it is an interesting question. I don't know. I think so. Google bombing is an issue that Google deals with a lot because companies have always had an incentive, with or without my book. They know that
to come to the top of the list.
They've always been trying to, that playing around with the search data can greatly increase their profitability, their placement, and therefore profitability. So Google has been fighting for years against these Google bomb attacks,
fake Google
these
searches.
bot attacks. And I think the data that is provided by Google Trends tries to take out every search that they think is not a legitimate search. And I think Google
really?
does.
Okay.
Well, yeah. So I think it's publicly known that a lot of Google searches are bots.
Yes.
And that's not that Google figures out are bots. And that would not be included in the Google search data. So I think if campaigns tried to do this, it would
be uncovered.
It would be uncovered. And one of the advantages of Google is they have such talented people that they tend to be always one step ahead of the computer scientist on a campaign or in another company. So I think that I'm not too worried about that.
That's great. So we're running low on time. So I wanted to conclude by pointing out you should have a slide in front of you about related resources from the conference board. And I believe, is there a survey where we ask for feedback at the end? And I would love for you to give us some feedback on the topic and the presentation today. And Seth and I are going to be moving to a conference room here at the conference board office in New York, and to do a little kind of brainstorming session with any of the researchers, any of my colleagues who want to mosey on down. And so that'll be on Facebook Live. At least a little bit of our meeting will be on Facebook Live. So look for us there. And thank you for joining us. Seth, thank you so much for coming and talking. It's been really fun.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks to all the viewers for joining us, and hope to see you at another TCB webcast soon.